This concert features 3 pieces of music that each memorialize something lost in completely different ways. Each has the feeling of a requiem. In 1939, the Japanese government commissioned the relatively young English composer Benjamin Britten to write a piece to celebrate the 2600th anniversary of the ruling dynasty of the Japanese Emperor Hirohito. Britten was an odd choice, given his widely known, discussed, and denounced pacifism and objection to the Second World War. He responded with a piece that is perhaps his loudest and most angry, and certainly one of his most powerful, the Sinfonia da Requiem. Each of the 3 movements takes its title from the Requiem Mass, in an explicit denunciation of the violence and war that was ripping Europe apart. Britten's parents had recently died, and it's possible he'd intended to write a requiem for them even before the commission arrived. The first movement is entitled Lacrimosa, after the part of the requiem that describes the day of tears when guilty man shall be judged. Britten describes the music as follows: a slow marching lament. The first section of the movement is quietly pulsating. The second is a long crescendo leading to a climax based on the opening melody. There is a terrifying feeling of creeping dread throughout, a clear disapproval of war. The second movement is Dies Irae, the section of the Requiem Mass that describes the world burning into ash. Britten writes a dance of death over a quiet marching rhythm. We hear a creepy tune from the saxophone, which always sounds like an outsider in the orchestra. Britten described the movement as a series of climaxes, of which the last is the most powerful, causing the music to disintegrate and to lead directly into the finale, which is entitled Requiem Aeternam. Very quietly, over a background of solo strings and harps, the flutes announce the quiet principal tune of the movement. There's a middle section in which the strings play a flowing melody, and this grows to a short climax, but the opening tune is soon resumed, and the work ends quietly in a long, sustained clarinet note. The final part of a requiem usually offers hope, with the prayer that eternal light will shine upon the departed. But here we're given no such confidence, and we end in a place of deep ambivalence. This is an absolutely overpowering work of blistering intensity. Britten's horror at the state of his contemporary world is frighteningly relevant in our own politically uneasy present. This season, we've already heard music by Arnold Schoenberg, the father of the Second Viennese School, a trio of composers who in the early years of the 20th century broke away from the traditional tonal scheme that had organized music for centuries. The First Viennese School was Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. Schoenberg, along with his 2 students, Anton Webern and Alban Berg, make up the trio of the second. Of these 3 composers, Alban Berg's music remains the most closely linked to the romantic aesthetic of the late 19th century. The Violin Concerto was his last work, written in 1935. Berg entitled the work To the Memory of an Angel. The angel was Manon Gropius, the daughter of Alma Mahler, widow of the composer Gustav Mahler, and Walter Gropius, the architect and founder of the Bauhaus movement. Manon died of polio at the age of 18 in 1934. Before we talk about Berg's Violin Concerto, I need to explain a little bit of music theory. Most classical music written between the 17th and early 20th centuries can be described as tonal. That means that it's built out of the familiar chords and scales we hear every day in Mozart, nursery rhymes, Ariana Grande, house music, and commercials. In tonal music, music is in a key, and that key is home. It's more important than any other chords or notes in the piece. The music might wander away, but it usually returns to that home key, which is called the tonic. As the 19th century progressed, music tended to wander away from the tonic for longer and longer. By Wagner's time, it's often impossible to say what the tonic is at any given moment, even though we can sense that it's there most of the time. But by Schoenberg at the beginning of the 20th century, music had become so chromatic, so far away from the home key, that we sense tonality beginning to collapse. Schoenberg realized this and began to write atonal music, music that isn't in any key at all. We heard some atonal music earlier this season in Schoenberg's 5 orchestral pieces. When the home key, the tonic, disappears, a kind of musical chaos ensues. We don't feel the tension and release that comes from the hierarchical relationship between the notes that tonality provides. Often, Schoenberg's atonal compositions are short because he couldn't figure out how to keep them going for very long without tonality. Recognizing this problem, he came up with a system to structure atonal music so that no one note is more important than the others, but to also help it keep going longer. In this system, which he called serialism, all 12 notes of the black and white keys in one octave of the piano keyboard are equal, and none of them can be repeated before all the other 11 have sounded. If one did, then it would end up being more important than the others, and we'd be headed back towards tonality. The vast majority of the music that the three composers of the Second Viennese School wrote, that's Schoenberg, Webern, and Berg, is serial. Each serial piece starts with the composition of a note row. The composer decides what order the 12 notes of the chromatic scale will appear in. Then he can turn that row backwards, upside down and backwards, and so on. The order of the notes in the row affects the character of the piece. So if the composer chooses an order in which all the notes are very close together, the music will end up sounding tight and claustrophobic. Whereas if he chooses notes that are far apart, the piece will sound spacious and airy. Alban Berg was still a romantic at heart. His music often sounds as if it's still tonal, even though it isn't. So how is that? Well, in the Violin Concerto, Berg chooses a note row that reeks of tonality. Each of the notes in the note row is a fifth apart, the same distance between the pitches of each open string on a violin. Now, tonal music is full of fifths. That's the most important relationship in tonality. So by choosing a note row that is reminiscent of tonality, but using it serially, Berg can have his cake and eat it. The concerto begins with the violin playing its open strings. It sounds exactly like what you hear before the start of a concert when the musicians tune their instruments. The music sounds like it's suspended in time. Berg weaves in folk songs from the Austrian mountains, Viennese waltzes, and even fragments of popular music. The second movement begins with a cry of pain, but after a few moments, the solo violin begins to play an extraordinary melody, a Bach chorale, a hymn tune Bach wrote for his church. Berg even writes the words in the score under the melody. It is enough. Lord, when it pleases you, then grant me release. My Jesus, come. World, good night. I go to the heavenly house with a heart full of joy. My sorrows remain below. It's a hymn that was often sung at memorial services, so it's laden with extra musical meaning, connecting the music to Berg's angel, Manon Gropius. The great conductor Otto Klemperer described the variations that follow as bringing into being music that seems to span the cosmos, from the lowest depths to the sublime heights. When we've been hearing atonal music for so long, the effect of hearing a hymn tune is overwhelming. The sense of coming home is heartbreaking, and we feel like we've left Earth and been transported into another realm, just like Berg's angel. Edward Elgar composed his First Symphony between 1907 and 1908. At its premiere, the English tabloid The Daily Mail, then, not now, a reputable newspaper, commented, "It's quite plain that here we have perhaps the finest masterpiece of its type that ever came from the pen of an English composer." At its first rehearsal with the London Symphony Orchestra, Hans Richter, the German conductor who'd given its premiere weeks before in Manchester, began by addressing the musicians. "Gentlemen," because of course there were no women in orchestras then, "let us now rehearse the greatest symphony of modern times, written by the greatest modern composer, and not only in this country. The symphony opens with a long motto theme that will recur in each movement in different guises. Its moderate pace immediately suggests a procession, and its somber character has a nostalgic quality. Like the other pieces in this concert, perhaps a sense of requiem for something past. Elgar marks the score andante nobilmente e semplice, at a walking pace, noble and simple. Once we've heard this motto theme, the main allegro of the movement begins with a sense of tension and passion. The second movement is a scherzo, reversing the usual order of the middle movements in a symphony. The opening has a nervous quality, sometimes pompous, even malevolent. This alternates with a more nostalgic and sweet music that conjures images of walking through the countryside, of fields and hedges on a warm summer's day. The final moments are very beautiful, and Elgar achieves a technical tour de force. The music slows down with a mysterious quality, leading directly into the third movement, an intimate adagio. And here, the main melody is actually a slower version of the scurrying, nervous theme that began the scherzo. This has a cathartic effect. That which was upsetting is now comforting, like making up with an estranged friend. The slow movement is the emotional heart of the symphony. A rich, life-giving melody begins in the violins, which contains all the strength and grace of Elgar's finest music. Music that encourages you to be a better person, to take a more generous view of others and the world around you. The movement ends with great tenderness and nostalgia. The finale begins with a heavy-laden series of fragments from the first movement and hints at the melody that's about to arrive. When it does arrive, it is turbulent and belligerent. The final minutes of this symphony are some of my favorite in all of music. I have never managed to listen to them without my eyes welling up with tears, so I'm working on my stamina as the performances approach. Whereas the belligerent theme stopped the music in its tracks previously, when it returns, it flows forward into music of triumph and elation, perhaps what it feels like flying over the tops of buildings at great speed. The motto theme which began the symphony returns in the trumpets and horns, triumphant, as the rest of the orchestra bursts in with syncopated explosions of joy that never cease to make the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. Hearing the motto theme, which began so unassumingly at the symphony's beginning, now transformed at its end, after the passion of the first movement, the sinister mystery of the second, the love and generosity of the third, and the belligerent opposition of the finale, all gives us a sense of having experienced a great deal alongside Elgar, a life even. And now we have arrived back where we started, with the same music, but transformed. We've come home with a cathartic sense of having survived life's tribulations. For me, there are few moments in music that have such power and such a sense of joy and completeness and rightness and deep, deep love. So we end our concert of requiems not with death, but with life.